2015 was a very interesting year for liberty. You saw the debates for sex workers' rights and to end the pointless war on drugs somewhat join forces with the campaign for privacy. And at the bottom of this, there is an autonomy understanding that is slowly starting to surface, and that which may lead to something much bigger. We've got Hans Legnell, resident activist and strong voice in the privacy debate, to comment on the matter. I'm Rick Falkvinge, this is Liberty Talk 47. While the fight for privacy, while the struggle to end the war on drugs, and while the voice for sex workers' rights climbed a lot last year in 2015, you also saw legislators crack down on these liberties across the board. The year ended with CISA in the United States, which basically means that the state gets to tap all the data all the time with no warrants, and it was carelessly tacked on to a budget bill, or perhaps not so carelessly, because that was the only way that they would be able to get it through without the public being able to challenge it, because you couldn't possibly challenge a budget bill which shows a democratic deficit in its own terms. We've got state Trojans coming up to the surface yet a fucking again, with presidential candidates in the United States and states in Europe saying that governments need to be able to circumvent encryption. Politicians are literally trying to claim that technology people must invent a branch of mathematics that work for one person but doesn't work for another. And they have no idea how bloody dumb they sound when they claim that it's possible to create a version of 1 + 1 = 2 that works for one person but not for another person. And this is really how dumb they sound to anybody understanding encryption when they claim this. This is not new. We've seen this in the 1990s when strong encryption came to the masses, and Phil Zimmermann launched Pretty Good Privacy, which for the first time enabled the common person to encrypt their correspondence. This was at the times of Echelon, when governments really had in their mind that they had somehow a right to wiretap the common person. And there came Phil Zimmermann and gave the ordinary person a tool to stay off the governmental radar, or at least stay dark on the radar. And of course, those governments went absolutely batshit insane and decided it was time to not ban encryption. Actually, yes, France did ban encryption for private individuals, which is an interesting example in and of itself. But the United States decided that strong encryption was a military export and banned the program from being exported from the country. The courts shot this down quite summarily by deciding that no, you cannot shoot down math, you cannot decide that math is a weapons export. This is free speech, this is code is speech, go stick something wherever you like it, was essentially the message from the courts. And the governments have not given up on this, they still want that power back. We're seeing the 1990s all over. This is a fight for privacy. And freedom of speech cannot exist without privacy, as you have the right to say something. That is not a right to say something in a padded room to yourself. The concept embodies that right to communicate an idea to another person. And by definition, by extension, that action needs to involve choosing the person to communicate the idea to. Freedom of speech is a mislabeled right. It is a right of private correspondence. It is a right of private correspondence. So the freedom of speech is a basis for all other liberties. If those liberties cannot be discussed, they cannot exist. George Orwell observed this in 1984 with his concept of newspeak. It's pervasive through the book 1984, but it's not really until the epilogue, when Orwell explained why this was so pervasive in the book, that you come to realize that if a language removes the ability to express a thought, that is a much stronger and more effective mechanism of repression than just making it illegal to say something. When you can make it impossible to say something, that is a much more effective way of keeping people in line. Compare, for example, the concept of polyamory, which is finally starting to surface. This word is very weird in that it combines a Greek and Latin root, the Greek poly, with the Latin amory, as in the ability to fall in love with several people at the same time. The reason you couldn't discuss this was that if you'd gone all Greek, the proper term would have been polygamy, which is a crime, being married to multiple people at the same time. So how do you discuss how you feel when the word available for discussing how you feel is the name of a crime? Freedom of speech is about saying things other people don't want you to say. And we're seeing a very weird thing happen at US universities with this, where freedom of speech is being seen as a bad thing. Now, cutting here, just summoning my thoughts. Now, welcoming Hans Liegnell here, who has been a strong voice in the privacy debate, particularly in Sweden, but also internationally, and has also seen these sex workers' rights, the pointless war on drugs, the connection from privacy to autonomy, and all of these interesting things come together. You've seen this happen, Hans. What's your take on this?
Well, I think these three issues belong together. You talk about privacy, but it's privacy in, to be able to correspond with your friends or family without anyone reading it. That's one form of privacy. But there's also a privacy of your more intimate, your body, to be able to do what you want with your body. That's also about privacy. So these issues, I think they belong together. But on the whole mass surveillance issue, I'm sadly not very optimistic. There's no political way to stop the madness, quite the contrary. In Sweden, we have a government now that is willing to take further steps on expanding the surveillance state, and the opposition is not even barking about it. So I think it's very tough to do anything about this right now. We have a Green Party in the government, which was so against mass surveillance when in opposition and not saying anything now about it. They basically become a doormat for the Social Democrats. I guess they're getting something in return, green taxes or something. So I do think we need to take a different approach on this issue now.
What is that approach?
The approach is to make resistance with encryption, I think. Encrypt your emails, your hard drives, use Tor, use VPN services, all that. That's the approach. And we need to get that message out to ordinary citizens that we're not really thinking about these issues daily.
Right. So how do you counter the narrative then from the government in this, that if you're using encryption, then you're a bad person because you're trying to hide your illicit drug trade, you're trying to hide contraband, you're trying to buy services from sex workers, all of which is illegal. So obviously, if you're using encryption, you're a criminal, you're a bad person, and you're trying to hide crimes against, whatever moral laws are out there. This is a bullshit narrative, but it's out there. So how do you counter it?
Yeah, that's the argument they use, of course. And that's why we need to get ordinary people, your grandma, your sister, everyone to use encryption and to make it something completely normal.
Right. We tried that since 1990s with PGP. Frankly, it sucks. It's absolutely awful to use. It was launched in 1991? It's not gone anywhere. It still requires a custom plugin to Thunderbird, run on Ubuntu, which is a flavor of GNU Linux, which nobody sensible has usually heard about, and third-party services that you like Gmail, Hotmail, basically every kind of usable email is a third-party service that need to decrypt your mail for you anyway, so they, by definition, cannot provide end-to-end encryption. And on mobile, you have a few services like Signal, you have Telegram has a good end-to-end encryption, but it's not the default, which is a horrible design decision. How do you bring this to the masses? It's been 25 years.
Yeah, that's the big problem. I think there are two issues here. The most important one is to the people with the know-how need to develop something easier. Something that it's very user-friendly for your grandma. That has to be the goal. Your grandma should be able to use it. But it's also about getting people aware of why surveillance is wrong. The surveillance today, the mass surveillance, is so subtle
It
You,
is.
you don't notice when people read your emails or even your Skype calls. That's something, it's hard to get that into people's minds, I think, that they're actually being surveilled. So that's also something we need to do. We need
It
to.
is. And how do you do that? I mean, there was the Swedish then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carl Bildt, said something about this on the Internet Days, which is a rather large internet technology and society conference. I think was 2 years ago, saying that no, your liberties were not violated because you couldn't see them being violated. And while this is a absolutely horrible statement, and I don't remember it exactly, but that was the gist of it. While this is an absolutely horrible statement, the man has a point, because you're not getting upset if you're not seeing consequences to your liberties being violated.
Right. Yeah, and that's the biggest problem. I think people don't notice. I mean, if the scale of this surveillance is like people following you every step you take from your home to your work, reading the letters you get in your mailbox, in physical letters, all that. If that was the case, people would be upset and they wouldn't tolerate it. But now everything is through your computer and your phone, and so people don't notice it. So that's, I mean, we just need to get the word out there, exactly how surveilled people are.
Yeah, like when you go shopping for something on Amazon and all of a sudden Facebook just plasters your feed with ads for leather pants or something which you just looked up completely randomly on Amazon. That's
Right.
one of the few cases I've actually seen people react. But is that negative enough to make people question the fact? Also, it's notable that Amazon is not governmental surveillance. This is still a case of voluntary tracking, which may be just as bad in itself, but at least Amazon is not going to break down your door because of your opinions.
Right. But that's also a problem with a few companies getting very, very big and powerful. Amazon is, I mean, they're selling stuff, sure, but you can buy it from someone else, but you can't really ignore, or it's very difficult to ignore, Microsoft, Google, Apple. I mean, the big 4 or 5 IT companies in the world. If you ignore all of them, you're going to have a bit of difficulty in your life, actually, to work.
Yep.
So that's it's voluntary to use it, but if you don't, it will complicate things for you, really.
It does, which brings us to another aspect of free speech, actually. Like, if you want to associate with people today, you need to be on Facebook. Whether you like it or not, that's how people meet. That's how they associate their freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of opinion, and so on and so forth. But here's the catch. This is a private arena run by a private company on private servers. It is not a public space. And yet, freedom of speech is being enforced onto those private servers by a corporate policy. So as these freedoms moved from the public space onto private servers, are we facing a hard choice here, whether freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly takes priority over property rights, or whether those property rights take priority over freedoms of speech, assembly, and so on, and what would be the consequences of that? This is not a dilemma we had to face when people were actually talking, outside.
Right, and I mean, Facebook is everybody using it now. So, and I think everybody knows you can't write what you like on Facebook. You can't post the pictures you like. You're going to get banned, or your account will get closed down. So, I mean, it's getting into people's minds, I think, and maybe that's affecting them outside of Facebook too. What they can and cannot say or post or do. So it is a kind of censorship, of course.
I mean, people know that if you post nudity on Facebook, then you risk being ostracized from your entire social life.
Right.
And I mean, there are many parties which has completely harmless nudity, non-sexual nudity, like just on a random beach, wherever. And yet you cannot discuss this. You cannot express this thought. So
I mean,
if we toy with the idea that Facebook decided you can't discuss drugs, you cannot discuss sex work, how does trying to reconnect these 3 topics here again? Privacy, which you're right, privacy of body is a privacy, absolutely. But we're seeing these developments. Put differently, if we'd had today's surveillance in the 1960s or 1970s, what movements would never have been able to form? What positive developments would we not have had today?
Yeah, I mean, potentially this is closing down potential movements for the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you measure that cost?
Well, I'm not being optimistic again here. I think it's really hard to stop this. I mean, people are using Facebook, and what can you do? You can of course you can use something else. I'm sure there will be something else after Facebook in 5 years or so. But I think the problem will be probably the same. It will still be a big American company starting it probably, and they have their policies that you have to follow, just like Microsoft and Apple and Google and everyone. And Google did something. I think it was last spring that they wanted to restrict what you could post on your Blogger blog,
Right.
which is owned by Google. And there was an outrage, and it was actually stopped. So I mean, they want customers too. So sometimes they do listen, which governments don't. So
Fair enough. Which governments have the idea that they have not just the ability, but the right and maybe even the obligation to sort of shepherd the correct kind of speech into society. Even the United States has this because they are still absolutely neurotic about anything remotely sexual, whereas they gladly have what Europe would consider hate speech, which Germany is absolutely neurotic about and bans on sight, but where Germany has nude beaches, which they don't think twice about. So a lot of people are kind of blind to their own culture here. The reason Facebook is banning nudity is because it's an American company. If it were a German company, it would have no bans on that whatsoever, but would have very strong bans for anything even similar to hate speech.
Yeah, I think that's the good analysis. Absolutely. But I think here in Sweden, we think we're so liberal about these issues,
Right.
but we're not. I don't think we ever been, actually, compared to the United States maybe. But still, if you look back in history, there's always been a sense of what's right and wrong when it comes to sex, and what's normal and not. So
Right.
I don't
People
think
should be normal because that's good. All right. So wrapping up, we need to get people talking about these issues, and that's the only way forward. We need to make encryption usable, and that will lead us to a better future, even if it will still be a fight.
It will be, yeah, definitely. But we can't rely on politicians for this. We need to do it ourselves.
Right. Well, I think we've seen that, and I agree with that unfortunate assessment. So thank you, Hans, for the commentary. It's been a great discussion to open this year with. I'm Rick Falkvinge. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. This is Liberty Talk 47.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Produced using exclusively free software.